Hey guys, welcome to the Buck Brief. Wilfred Reilly back in the mix. He is a professor and author of Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, which is an excellent book. Highly recommend you get it. Professor, great to have you back in the mix.
Thanks for having me on. Good to be back on the show.
How are you feeling about the situation in this 2024 election right now? Kamala Harris, they're changing everything about her. They're telling us all kinds of things that are either untrue or they're saying things that were true or not true. What's going on? Is this going to work?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of worried as a guy that generally votes Republican. I mean, I think it might work. Yeah. I think what you had in this election were a lot of the double haters. I've heard people call them from other consultants in my side field over to commentators like Ben Shapiro. Those were people that just hated, Orange Julius Caesar, Donald Trump, and that also hated Joe Biden, who's been, dead for 3 years. They wanted no part of either candidate. And now Biden is gone. And Democrats who have been on the race and gender bandwagon for a decade now have a chance to vote for a black woman who's 59, which is a spring chicken in US politics right now. And so you've seen that vote that was at 14% for independents, right? For a while. RFK, Cornell West, all these people, Jorgensen that we've got in the race, technically, that's down to about 5%. And I think that's cut almost all away from Trump. So I'm a little worried.
I feel like in the end it'll all be okay, but maybe that's just a coping mechanism at this point because the Trump campaign does seem to be in a little bit of a tough patch, a rough spot. I would say. I know they're bringing back Corey Lewandowski. That was some of the news today from 2016. No, he wasn't even on the campaign for that long in 2016, so it feels a bit like they are unhappy at where the numbers have gone. But with Kamala Harris, it's fascinating to me, Professor. It seems like everyone knows that she's trying to do the bare minimum of campaigning and that that's the best thing for her, and somehow that doesn't seem to be a big problem, right? Like hiding from the public at some level is tactically smart and everyone knows it, and no one seems to find that to be disingenuous or dishonest.
Well, I think we've gotten used to this from these politicians during COVID-19 and then I guess this was during COVID-19, but I mean, the Biden campaign, the subsequent this campaign where Biden didn't want to engage Trump until that one disastrous debate. So, I mean, it's almost Kamala Harris has taken some heat for giving the same speech every time she talks. And I don't like Kamala Harris, but I want to remind you guys that that's called a stump speech. We used to see a lot of this where a politician would go give 5 or 6 speeches a week and they'd all be 80% identical. She'd go to Cleveland, Cincinnati, Toledo, Dayton. That's what they're supposed to do. So we've gotten used to politicians not really engaging the media, not really engaging the public. Harris, as I just implied, is actually doing that more than a lot of people. So is Trump, who's doing his rallies. The awkward reality there is that we're almost in September. The election's in November. So can Harris get away without more than, say, two tough press conferences, without more than one debate? Yeah, probably. Like, I don't think Harris would have had much of a chance against Trump if this had been a full-on year and a half traditional campaign, but it's not.
Yeah, it's remarkable that the truncated timeline does seem to be clearly an advantage for Harris, right? I mean, I don't know anyone who's disagreeing with that right now, and they're really hoping they can pull this off just as quickly as possible and with the bare minimum of vetting. But what do we do with actually before I get to that question, I want to ask you this. What do you find to be the most objectionable thing about Kamala Harris as somebody who is trying to become president of the United States? Like, what is the worst thing about Harris as far as you can see?
Well, it's not really. I mean, the things people bring up about past dating and all that, it's not really any of that at all. It's the most objectionable thing about Kamala Harris, I think, is that she's not the people's choice in any real way. And I mean, you could say, well, she might be if she wins this election. I mean, if she goes forward and she gets 51% over someone as popular as Trump, okay. She proved it. But Kamala Harris has never gotten a vote in a presidential election. I mean, this is someone who is. We hear this about Vance. We even heard it about Obama. Like they've only been in the Senate for a year. Harris is the classic example of this. I mean, she was a short-term senator from California, as I understand. She ran
Right.
against Joe Biden for the presidency, and she was out by the first primary.
Yeah.
And she was pretty ruthless in that campaign. I mean, she called Joe Biden a racist. She said some things that were right on the verge of lying, like when, I was a young girl that had to be bused to school in a racist America. I mean, Kamala Harris grew up in Berkeley. I mean, in a wealthy Indian American household. As I recall, the bus she took was to magnet school. So I mean, she really went hard at Mr. Biden. Despite that, he said he wanted a diverse woman. He kind of picked her up off the scrap heap. She became vice president. She was polling at 1.79% when he kind of rescued her. She became the vice president. She was one of the least popular VPs we've had. And now all of a sudden, because Biden is bringing her to the fore against Trump, I mean, she's polling very well. So we're in this weird situation where we could see Kamala Harris win or narrowly lose a presidential race despite never having gotten a presidential vote. It does look a little bizarre.
Yes, and I think also in the context of a party that had the super delegates essentially rig the system against Hillary in 2016, and then had the party powers that be decide that Joe Biden in 2020 would become the nominee after he was way behind everybody else. All of a sudden, South Carolina, it does feel like there's a system at work here that gets to make the important decisions for them. But we'll come back into that, Professor Riley, here in just a second. You know, sponsor this half hour is Tunnel to Towers Foundation. Jerry Paget enlisted in the U.S. Navy and deployed multiple times to Iraq and Afghanistan. While on patrol in Afghanistan, Jerry was injured in an improvised explosive device blast. He suffered a spinal cord injury, a traumatic brain injury, and audio and visual impairments. Nothing can reverse the damage done to Jerry's body that day, but through the Tunnel to Towers Foundation, we can honor heroes like Jerry in gratitude for their tremendous sacrifices. We understand the price of freedom, and we can choose to honor those who fight for it despite its tremendous cost. Thanks to friends like you, Jerry and his family moved into a new smart home at the Foundation's Let Us Do Good Village in Florida. Nothing can repay the price of freedom, but your donation can change the lives of those who selflessly sacrifice for our communities and country. Donate $11 a month to Tunnel to Towers at T2T.org. That's T, the number 2, T.org. Now, on the border, clearly there's sensitivities about the Biden administration letting in 8 to 10 million illegals. No one, there's no real number, and we're still finding out even what the official number is going to be for fiscal year 24. But it's a huge number. Everyone knows that. And they're trying to run stories about Kamala Harris as though she's a border hawk now. Even some ads, you've probably seen these. Is the audience for this essentially people who are looking for an excuse to vote for Harris? Or is the audience people that just don't know anything and so, they'll see this and actually believe it?
Well, I think the audience is Democrats and independents. So, I mean, it's people who think that Harris is maybe 5% too soft on the border and who are ready to be convinced or something like that. Like, who could hear that Trump blocked a bipartisan immigration bill that Harris supported.
Right.
I mean, for conservatives who are fairly well educated on immigration, the impression would be something like, well, Harris is 200% too soft on the border. I mean, there tends to be some knowledge from your audience and mine that Harris was, in fact, the quote unquote border czar. That's a pretty good title for it. So people aren't really gonna fall for the nonsense. But I mean, you're pitching people who don't really know a lot about immigration. You're pitching people who are from her party who think she was just a little bit on the soft side. Yeah, that's what your target base is going to be there. And I mean, there's a lot of stuff like this. I mean, generally, when you do something like, I mean, the bearded white guys for Kamala Harris call, where you had all these guys. I mean, some of them were effete nerds, but some of them were in pretty good lumberjack cosplay. But where all of them were saying, as a white man who played Gandalf on television, I'll be given to Kamala Harris. You're not really pitching to base camps in North Dakota and so on with that sort of thing. What you're doing is appealing to a general, mostly female audience of independents by saying, well, look, I mean, there's a diverse pool of people coming out for this candidate. I mean, I would assume that one of the big effects of that is that you increase donations from white women. So there's
Mm.
actually a sophisticated kind of chess playing that goes on with that kind of thing.
Is Trump the wrong candidate now that Kamala Harris is the Democrat candidate?
It's actually a great question. I mean, is Trump the wrong candidate? I mean, I've always liked the big guy myself, but I mean, so Trump's advantages over Biden were very clear and evident. I mean, so Trump is an older guy, but he's this big, vigorous man. He's mid 70s. Biden is, I believe, over 80s, 81.
Hmm.
So Trump can come out and make Biden look pretty foolish, but I mean, in mid to late 70s, that's pretty old. So when Harris, who's 59, comes out and speaks, and you have Trump on the other side of the podium, it's possible for her to do to him what Trump did to Biden. Um, yeah, and a lot of Harris also, as a black woman, has advantages on the Democratic side that Biden really didn't. The Democrats have played a race and sex based game for a really long time. So Kamala Harris is kind of a dream candidate for a lot of their bases. I mean, black women are the most reliable Democratic voting bloc. And Kamala Harris can do the entire dim pitch to them. Like every 4 years, you have to come out and save America, my sisters. I went to Howard. I pledged AKA Alpha Kappa Alpha. You know, I'm not going to do the sorority noise, but like it's just I mean I've dated people that are from that background. Like it's going to be pretty effective. The whole like boss lady thing, race aside, all of that is going to be brought against Trump. I mean, Trump was civilly found liable of not of rape and all, but of sexual assault, public sexual contact with a woman. Like Harris can bring all that against Trump, whereas Biden, who's an older male in a Brooks Brothers suit, who also has been charged with worse sexual contact.
Mm.
I mean, he could not have done any of that.
Yeah, let's get into what you think Trump can do to offset some of that and to get back on track here for a win. But first up, there's a lot happening. We're talking about it here on the show, a lot going on week in, week out. And that's why I've launched a new newsletter. And it's going to keep you informed about politics, current events, and also the markets. Now, I'm not a markets guy. My friend Brad Thomas is, though. So we're partnering up with Wide Moat Research. That's Brad's company. And we're going to be putting out a weekly newsletter. Comes out on Mondays. Brad is a brilliant guy. He's helped thousands, tens of thousands of people make lots of money in the markets. So we're going to have the fusion of political and economic knowledge in this newsletter. So we'll be publishing it weekly, and it's free. If you want to be prepared, go online to theurgentmessage.com. You can go check it out for yourself and sign up right now. Go to theurgentmessage.com, theurgentmessage.com. Professor Reilly, what does Trump have to accomplish between now and the election to win this election?
Well, that's a good question. I think what Trump has to accomplish is getting his voters as excited as Harris's voters and getting them out to the polls. And it's going to be somewhat uphill for Trump because he also has to overcome a certain degree of, I won't say cheating, but flexibility in the voting rules that benefits the other party.
Yeah.
So, like when we talk about the last election, I mean, people ask, was the election rigged? Almost every time as a right leaning political consultant you talk. And there are two ways to look at that. One is like, did they actually have boxes of fake votes hidden under tables in Chicago? And as tempting as it is to say yes, as a former Chicago businessman, no, probably not. But the second question is, were there people that were by one vote in state legislatures with a two-vote Democratic margin changing the election laws so that you could vote by mail for 4 weeks before the election, with votes being counted for 6 days after the election, this sort of thing? Like we both know that happened.
Yeah.
I mean, and there were votes being counted for a week in some states after voting had closed. I mean, there's that famous graphic of as boxes of votes were coming in, the vote totals changing from pro-Trump to pro-Biden. Now that I actually am a trained statistician, that does not necessarily indicate technical fraud. But what it does indicate is something that you almost never see in a first world electoral process. I mean, you don't normally allow people to fill out ballots and then put four of them in the same time in the mailbox in front of their house and wait for someone else to collect them. And all of that stuff advantages the Democrats who live in concentrated urban areas, who have well organized ballot harvesting operations. I don't know why there was never any mainstream media attention paid to this, but there's quite a famous Veritas or something video of someone in Ilhan Omar's Minneapolis driving around with a car full of votes saying, I got them pretty much legally, but here's a car full of votes. So the Republicans are going to have to overcome all of that, which is worth maybe half a point. So to do that, Trump is going to have a really on point message, a really on point operation. Now, when I think Trump, I think, decent, effective leader. I don't actually think really on point. I don't think a guy in every state of, Scott Pressler quality, going out, knocking on doors, getting everyone ready to go on message, unfortunately. I do think that Trump has a pretty effective message, which is that Biden has been one of the worst presidents in recent history.
Yeah.
And I don't say that just because I'm more likely to vote for the other party. I mean, when you think about the Biden administration, there's been kind of this default. If you've ever owned a parrot, kind of almost avian squawk from the media, best ever. But I mean, like, if you look at what's happened, I mean, you saw crime after George Floyd skyrocket over 20,000 murders for 2 or 3 years. I mean, 2020, 2021, 2022. You can't blame that on Trump. Trump was out of office for 2 of those years. I mean, inflation got up to 9%. This went on until what, early last year? I mean,
It's bad.
immigration, this has been, yeah, bad.
It's a bad record.
Good summary.
It's been
It's
pretty.
crazy.
Well,
The
it's pretty
whole
funny too, because Kamala, depending on what the issue is either a continuation of the Biden legacy,
Yes.
or has nothing to do with Biden, right? And it changes day to day. It's been a pretty astonishing process to see how that goes. I want to ask you about the debates here in just a second, but
Yeah.
since the war between Israel and Hamas started after the terrible terrorist attacks of October 7th, the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews has been on the front lines in Israel, addressing the needs of the most vulnerable. That's why I've partnered with the IFCJ. Your life saving donation will help provide emergency food as well as critical security needs such as flak jackets, firefighting equipment, armored vehicles, bomb shelters, and more. We're looking for 500 listeners to join the fellowship and me by donating $150 to meet these urgent security needs. And thanks to a generous IFCJ supporter, your gift will be matched, doubling your impact in the Holy Land. Call to make your gift right now at 888-488-IFCJ. That's 888-488-IFCJ, or go online to supportifcj.org to give. That's supportifcj.org. Professor Reilly, his book is Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, which is excellent. Go pick up your copy. Professor, the debates, we've got Harris and Trump in two that have been agreed on. She won't do Fox News, which I said on radio. There's no way she's going to do the Fox News debate, and which is ridiculous, but that's the way it is. J.D. Vance and Tim Walz, mano a mano one time. Does it matter? If so, why? Or if not, why?
Well, the debates do matter because, I mean, as we saw with Joe Biden, a good debate can really make or break a race. I don't expect Trump and Harris are both fairly good debaters. I mean, they both have the potential for an embarrassing moment, but I don't really see that as incredibly likely. I think Harris will come at Trump and try to play the tough prosecutor, saying things like, you're convicted of 34 felonies. I'm the kind of person that puts bad white men like you in jail. But I mean, I think Trump can come back and easily note, well, you haven't put a lot of people in jail recently at all, have you? And bring up crime, bring up the border czar role, so on down the line. The only people you put in jail were poor young black men with bags of weed 25 years ago. So they can go back and forth at each other. The Vance Walz debate, I'd give the edge to Vance there because of the quote unquote stolen valor issue. And I mean, I looked into that, and it seems like this is a real albatross for Tim Walz. Like, I feel like Harris didn't have the time to investigate this. Walz was a guy who was in the National Guard for 24 years, didn't deploy beyond trips to Italy and Germany, and essentially found out his regiment was going to be sent to Iraq and left. I mean, mentioned that he was in the middle of a congressional race, filed papers, separation papers to leave the military. Obviously, pulled some strings because he was in the middle of that run for a power position to get out. You can't separate after 4 years if you're in for 6. I have a lot of buddies in the military and officer roles. Got out. He was able to leave. And JD Vance was a combat Marine. I mean, he was in a combat zone. I don't know if he took fire himself, but I mean, that's something that is going to be brought up. The other thing with this, because otherwise they both would have served honorably, Wall seems to have spent years arguing that he was in not just a war but a combat zone. I mean, he said things like, "I care. No one should carry an AR-15 like I did in the war." Like, I've listened to these quotes, and as someone who respects the troops, I listened with the most sympathetic ear possible. It's impossible to mistake. I mean, he did this over and over again. I mean, his congressional medal, the sort that they can give to friends and local leaders. I mean, it has a command sergeant major's insignia on it. You can just Google Walls metal and you'll see it. I mean, it's the top rocker, the bottom. It's got 10 stripes on it, star in the middle. So, I mean, I think JD Vance is going to be savvy enough about the military, speaking to a heavily Republican audience, to point some of that out, to have drawings with him and so on. So I think Vance wins out. Walls is probably going to try to play the weird card. But by this point, Vance's dirty tricks guys, if you're on Twitter, have put out similar stories about Walls. So both of them may just avoid mutually assured destruction there. In terms of actual practice, I think Vance has a heavy advantage there. Trump and Harris, I'd expect a more even fight. Again, right now, I'd give Harris a slight advantage just based on that edge of novelty. And again, this is something a Republican can never forget, the electoral advantage of the way the election is structured and the fact that Harris has the entire media behind her running stories like this is the Kamala nominee. That's a real headline.
Wow. I know the media has been doing crazy stuff, fabricating this whole narrative about Kamala. Before I let you go, you're a professor. You're a very, very well-read guy. We've talked before about some history stuff. It's mid-August. Some people, like me, are going to be taking off some time soon, want a book to read. If someone's looking for a book to read, a history recommendation that you would say is just can't miss, it's so well written, such an interesting topic, what would it be? What would be your recommendation for whether you're by the lake, the pool, out in the woods, whatever?
I and my buddies right now are reading some of those real like manly man's history books. Like one is called The Washing of the Spears, which is about the Bantu migration. The Bantu migration is the forgotten great conquest. It's how the sort of medieval tech level black people that we think of as black took over Africa. There used to be a lot of other people in Africa, pygmies, which are called Khoisan, Bushmen, coastal Caucasians, basically whites, North Africans. Now there aren't. The black warriors basically killed them all, got a little more primitive as they moved south. So Washing of the Spears is about the Zulus and all that, how they came into South Africa. The Zulus invading from the north basically got into South Africa when the whites invading from the south got into South Africa. And this proved to be very bad for like the sort of lovely sheep herding people that were there at the time. So the Washing of the Spears is a good book about the Zulu Wars. There's another one called the Wheel, the Horse, and Fire or something. You'll Google the Wheel, the Horse, you'll find it. But that's the one we have queued up after that. It's about the Yamnaya. There were these fairly civilized sort of chariot riding people that existed before recorded history. They had kind of a written language. They just couldn't really figure out how to write it down before paper. But those were the people that came out of like the Great Steppe and sort of began European civilization. And they were almost forgotten until people started doing archaeology out in the sea of grass there. And they had some amazing, beautiful stuff. So we're now starting to rediscover them. So those are my two books about like historical travels and conquests right now. One group of white guys, one group of black guys.
All right, there we go. I'm going to pick them up. And Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, which is Wilfred Reilly's book. Professor, have a great rest of summer. We'll talk to you after Labor Day, and thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for having me on.